Testing, testing, testing. Okay, one of the most difficult parts of this chapter is the action potential because it usually conjures up many nightmares for students because it can be quite a confusing thing to explain action potentials or nerve impulse. So first thing first, let's do a bit of a brief introduction. What exactly are action potentials and nerve impulse? For the purpose of this video, anytime I use the word action potential, nerve impulse, or electrical impulse, they all mean the same thing, by the way. The action potential, nerve impulse, or electrical impulse are just terms used to describe the signal that is traveling along the neuron. So don't worry about that. I've mentioned this before. Look at it's represented in those arrows where they travel from the sensory neuron to the relay neuron to the motor neuron. It also implies that if you can see this particular diagram here, the action potential is traveling along the axon, right? What does that signal or that action potential or that nerve impulse look like? We have to try to physically explain what exactly is this action potential all about. It's not just good enough to say, oh, action potentials are just these things that travel along the neuron. We need to know what's going on at the neuron level. So, what I'm drawing here is, as you can see, the axon here. Now, commonly, when I ask my students to explain a nerve impulse or action potential, they will say, especially students who have done a bit of physics, they will say, well, maybe electrical impulse, nerve impulse, action potential might be the same as electricity. So perhaps it is electrons moving along the axon or along the neuron. And while that is a good attempt at an explanation, that is not exactly what's going on at all. Because action potentials, nerve impulse, or electrical impulse are not electrons moving along the neuron. So if they are not electrons moving along the neuron, what exactly are they? Well, let's talk about it. So before I explain it in detail, I'm going to give you the textbook definition for action potential. And the textbook definition for action potential is as follows. Action potentials or nerve impulses, or electrical impulse, by the way, are defined as rapid change in the electrical charge distribution across a cell surface membrane. Now, if you read that statement and you go, huh? What? Can you slow down? What the hell does that mean? You are not alone, okay? It's not like, oh, students immediately go, okay, now I understand it completely. If you totally understand what I just said, 90% of the time you're probably lying, okay? And it's okay. A lot of my students will pretend that they understand, and I'll tell them, do you actually understand? And I'll ask them, do you actually understand it? And they'll go, no, okay, I don't. So don't worry about it. So we are going to break everything down into its fundamental parts, and then we'll explain it bit by bit, and then we'll join it back together. So I'm just highlighting rapid change, electrical charge distribution, and cell surface membrane. Now, along the axon, what cell surface membrane are we talking about, by the way? So imagine this motor neuron and this axon here, and I'm just showing you the direction of the electrical impulse. They're just moving towards the right side. Now, let's focus on the cell surface membrane first. Where exactly is the cell surface membrane? Remember, a neuron is a cell. Of course, they have cell surface membrane. So I'm just drawing part of the axon here. You can see the phospholipid bilayer, and the blue color part represents the inside of the axon. So whatever I'm circling in the axon represents that magnified image right there. So that's the cell surface membrane. But I'm going to simplify it. I'm just going to put like a single, purple line on each side. That represents the cell surface membrane. A to B just represents A is on the left side of the axon, which I'm circling in green, and B is on the right side of the axon, which is I'm circling that in blue, for example. So I'm just trying to say that the signal has to be sent from A to B. So now we understand the cell surface membrane. That's good. The second thing we have to understand is the electrical charge distribution. Now, what exactly does that mean? Now, if you notice, I'm putting negative symbols inside the axon, and I'm putting positive symbols outside the axon. This implies that the outside has a more positive charge and the inside has a less positive charge or more negative charge. That positive and negative charges are separated by the cell surface membrane. Now I want you to understand, you don't need to memorize this part, but what that positive and negative charge actually means is as follows. The electrical charge distribution across the cell surface membrane is affected by ions, by the way. Examples, as I'm drawing out here, you can see the axon. The blue color is the inside of the axon. Those orange colored dots represent positively charged ions. Now, examples of positively charged ions will be things like sodium ions and potassium ions, right? They give out positive charges. So, as an example here, if you notice in this diagram, the concentration of the ions inside the axon and outside the axon are almost the same. So, there is not much of an electrical charge difference between the two areas. Now, if we were to push out more of the ions out of the axon, we notice that there is a higher positive charge or higher concentration of positive ions outside the cell, and it's lower inside the cell or inside the axon in this diagram. Therefore, to make life simpler for ourselves, instead of writing the word higher positive charge outside, lower positive charge inside, it's too much of a hassle, we just simply represent it by using a positive symbol outside and a negative symbol inside. That's basically what it is. The positive and negative symbol implies that there is just a higher voltage outside and a lower voltage inside. This is known as the electrical charge distribution across the cell membrane, also referred to as membrane potentials, and they are measured in volts. And we will be talking about this further in detail in the next video, so I just need you to understand this part of the video first, okay? So that will help make life easier when we are studying resting membrane potential and such. The other important thing I want you to understand is when you look at this axon, it is not sending any signals yet. They are not sending any action potentials along the axon as of yet. Okay, so the point I'm just trying to make over here is before it's able to send any action potentials from A to B, it first has to make that electrical charge distribution where the outside is more positive or it has a higher charge and the inside has to be negative or it has a lower charge. That is first called the electrical charge distribution. If it doesn't have this, action potentials or nerve impulses cannot be sent at all. Okay, so this is most axons, before they are able to send any impulse, they first have to create that electrical charge distribution first. Now, remember I told you that action potential is a rapid change in the electrical charge distribution. For example, let's say I want to send the signal from A to B. Suddenly, what actually happens is, I just want you to see the highlighted part. What exactly happens to the highlighted part, by the way? At A, the charge flips. What do I mean by the charge flips? Now, the inside is positive and the outside is negative. That is called a rapid change, and it happens extremely quickly. So, the rapid change in electrical charge distribution happens at point A, or nearer towards A. Now, what is happening here is as follows, where suddenly at the next instant, it's the same axon, by the way, but I want you to see what happens in the next diagram. In the next diagram, the next part of the axon, the charge flips, where the inside is positive and the outside is negative. But look at the previous area. What happens to the previous area? It goes back to normal, right? So the next part undergoes a rapid change. And then what actually happens? After that, the next part. And then the next part, and then the next part, and then the next part, basically, until it reaches B. That is actually referred to as the action potential, by the way. That is what we actually have to understand about the rapid change. So the action potential are not electrons traveling. It's just basically the charge along the cell surface membrane changing. The charge flips. First it flips on the left side at A, and then it flips all the way to B. But it doesn't remain, and And you also have to understand, once it flips, it has to go back to normal. I use the word flip, but that's not the correct word to use, by the way. So I will explain that further in detail. But the point I'm just trying to make is the change is rapid, where the inside becomes positive for just one instant, and then it goes back to normal. And then the next area undergoes the same change. The charge distribution changes, and then the next part. It just continuously happens. Now, if you're still not sure, what you must first understand is the axon, for the axon to send a signal, it must have an electrical charge distribution, also referred to as membrane potential, where the inside has to be represented with negative and the outside has to be positive, where the inside has a lower charge and the outside of the axon has a higher charge. Good. That's called the electrical charge distribution along the cell surface membrane. And then what happens when A gets stimulated? We want to send the signal from A to B. So when A gets stimulated to send the signal, the charge nearer to A undergoes a rapid change, where the inside becomes positive and the outside becomes negative. And then what happens? The next area undergoes a rapid change. Good. But the previous area, the first one, returns back to normal. That's called the rapid change as well. Okay. And then what happens next? Same thing. Okay. And then the same thing until it reaches B. That is called action potential. But of course, you might be thinking, what is causing this positive? What's causing this negative to happen? Why is it moving? Why is the charge changing from one area to another? We will talk about that more in the next video.